Representatives of several world religions gathered at the Vatican to sign a joint appeal on climate change, which will be presented to global leaders at the United Nations Conference, COP26, in Glasgow in November, urging them to step up their efforts to stop climate change. Among those present were Archbishop of Canterbury Justin Welby, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, and delegations representing the Russian Orthodox Church and the Coptic Orthodox Church. Judaism, Islam, and Buddhism were also represented. The Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, who in 2019 signed the document on human fraternity with Pope Francis, was also in attendance. Nearly 40 religious figures spoke on behalf of their communities, highlighting the importance of working together to address environmental issues.
And we need this dialogue in order simply to be, simply to breathe, simply to love one another.
I think they have, as I said, a unique voice in being able to talk to their populations, but also to world leaders.
During the meeting, Pope Francis offered 3 concepts to guide the reflection on this joint project: openness to interdependence and sharing, the dynamism of love, and the call to respect. But he didn't read the rest of his prepared speech in order to let other people speak.
E per non usare del tempo che è necessario perché tutti parlino, lascio nelle vostre mani la trascrizione, voi potete leggerla e così andiamo avanti in questa celebrazione. Grazie.
Pope Francis then presented the signed appeal to ALOK SHARMA, president of COP26, and to Luigi Di Maio, Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. At the end of the interventions, each person poured soil on the roots of an olive tree that will be planted in the Vatican gardens. It's a symbol of their individual and collective commitment to care for the environment.
Calling on the world's faithful to join the fight to solve the climate crisis. 40 religious leaders gathered at the Vatican on Monday to add their voice to the growing chorus calling for world leaders to take real action to tackle the crisis. The Catholic Pope, Pope Francis, called the meeting but preferred to let others speak.
I call on all young people, regardless of their religion, to be ready to fight against any action that may damage the environment or increase the climate crisis.
The meeting was labeled Faith and Science, and many spoke of the need to fuse our rational and spiritual sides.
Together, faith and science, people of different faith can transform fear in hope, anxiety in confidence, inaction into action.
Others highlighted the responsibility religion confers on humanity.
That the water is the father, the air is the teacher, and earth is our common mother. Just as we don't dishonor our mother, father, and teacher, why would we dishonor these gifts from our Creator?
We must address the unequal economic systems and the human impacts of climate change.
Though they aren't political leaders, the president of the upcoming UN Environmental Conference says they have an important role.
There is a very unique voice that religious leaders have when they talk to other world leaders, the leaders of governments, and that, I think, is what now needs to happen. For that voice from the religious world, from the scientific world, to be amplified, to tell world leaders they have to act to protect our planet and our people.
Throughout his papacy, Pope Francis has supported environmental action. In 2015, he published his second encyclical, Laudato Si', in which he called for swift and bold action to tackle the climate crisis.
Last week, he virtually attended the Youth for Climate conference in Milan, backing the work of 400 young delegates as they drafted proposals for the UN summit. Meanwhile, outside conferences, a growing protest movement is adding its own pressure. A consensus has been building that real action must come out of the Scotland summit. And to that, we now have the support of the world's leading spiritual figures. Adam Rainey, Al Jazeera, Vatican City.
Some 3,000 perpetrators, more than 250,000 victims. For decades, the Catholic Church in France has provided fertile ground for child sex abuse by turning a blind eye or sometimes knowingly putting children in touch with predators.
Above all, there was a series of neglects, failures, silence, and an institutional cover-up. The Church did not know how to see, it did not know how to hear.
Surveys said that the church's indifference only started to really change around 2015. The damning report is the result of 2.5 years of independent investigation based on testimony from thousands of victims who broke their silence. It estimates that about 216,000 people have suffered abuse at the hands of priests, monks and nuns. The number goes up to 330,000 if cases committed by volunteers and other church members are included. The figures only apply to people who are now over 18 and are still alive. The inquiry found that most abuses occurred between 1950 and 1970. Then their numbers declined before they started picking up again in the early 90s. The vast majority of victims were pre-adolescent boys trapped in the culture of penance and confidentiality.
There were massive crimes and atrocious offenses. But there was also worse than that. There was betrayal. A betrayal of the innocence of your own people.
The Commission also issued 45 recommendations, including compensating victims and revising canon law.
Well, for more on the reaction from the Pope, let's bring in our Rome correspondent, Seema Gupta. Seema, there were some very strong words from Pope Francis at the Vatican today, particularly talking about shame.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the Pope acknowledged the French report at his weekly general audience at the Vatican, repeatedly and forcefully expressing his shame for the Church's failure, in essence, to protect the victims. He expressed sadness and pain for the trauma that the victims experienced. And he said it was his shame, but also the shame of the Church, for the Church's long inability to put those victims at the center of their concerns. Now, he repeatedly talked about it being a moment of shame. He said it was unfortunate that there was such a considerable number of victims, and encouraged the bishops and other superiors within the church in order to tackle this issue and make sure that it doesn't happen again. He also expressed his closeness to the priests in France and called on the Catholics in France to assume the responsibility to ensure that the church remains a safe place for all people who attend it.
Now, Seema, this comes as Italy is set to get a verdict in a church sex abuse case there, which actually hits quite close to home for the Pope as it takes place inside the Vatican.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the trial is happening in the Vatican of this particular priest, a young priest, Father Gabriele Martinelli. Now, he's been accused of sexually abusing a fellow altar boy when they were both still teenagers at the Vatican Youth Seminary. Now, that's a seminary within the Vatican walls itself, and that's what makes this particular case so significant. The trial has been going on for a year now. It began in October last year. We expect a verdict this month as well. But the scandal really erupted back in 2017 when the former altar boys went public with their accusations, alleging abuse as well as cover-ups by superiors. On trial is also the former rector of this seminary, and even the religious institution that is backing this seminary is being accused for failing to protect the young. Now, this particular individual, Gabriele Martinelli, now he's been accused of this abuse that happened while they were both underage, but Martinelli was 20 years old when the abuse was continuing. So we'll have to see what happens in this case, but of course it's a significant one, as you mentioned, happening right within the Vatican walls.
Seema, thank you for that. Seema Gupta there reporting for us from Rome.
For more, let's cross to Madrid. Marc Artsoudry is the European coordinator for SNAP, the Survival Network of Those Abused by Priests. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Yes, you're welcome. It's nice to be here.
Your reaction to this report, and when you read it, is France any different from other countries like the US, Australia, and more?
Yes, those are good questions. My reaction, first of all, is that at SNAP, we're very gratified to see a report with this sort of impact. I wasn't really expecting such an impact, and I'm really glad it's the report is reverberating throughout the world and throughout the media. This is a very big problem that has affected many countries, in similar ways, frankly. The situation in the US has been bad for decades. In the UK, in Spain, in Italy, very few countries have been unaffected by this. Very few countries where there is a Catholic presence have been unaffected by this. And just to make a point about the history, this report goes back to the 1950s. It's highly probable that this has been going on for centuries in the Catholic Church.
And it's only, says the report, in 2015 that the church's attitude starts to change. Is that something you felt?
The changes are slow, and there have been several fairly high-profile cases. And you're right, in the 2000s, the 21st century, that have brought this issue, this terribly tragedy for all these people to the surface. And it's because it has become over the years more and more difficult for these people to sort of disappear unnoticed. And survivors have been sort of fighting back, organizing themselves and organizing associations. And it's become very difficult for the perpetrators to get away with their crimes. Perhaps a little bit more so in France, where there's a strong secular tradition of the separation between church and state. I'm optimistic that will help survivors find justice finally. But the problem is that a lot of these people also, the perpetrators, have died.
The approach of nearly 150 warplanes in waves sent over several days has clearly alarmed Taiwan. Speaking at a session of Taiwan's parliament, Defense Minister Chiu Kuo-cheng warned that in 4 years, China would be capable of invading the island.
China does not currently possess such capabilities, but we must consider the consequences. In our judgment, by 2025, they will have more comprehensive capabilities.
Taiwan regularly holds drills to prepare for such an invasion. Thanks in part to sophisticated military equipment from its ally, the United States, it's so far been confident of deterring any aggression. But China's rapid military buildup has been closing that gap.
I think Beijing is looking to put enormous pressure psychologically and operationally on Taiwan, including the Taiwan society as well as the Taiwan armed forces.
It also appears to be looking to undermine Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen, who has been cold to the idea of closer relations and is seen by China as an obstacle to its ultimate goal of unification. With these latest incursions, it seems Beijing wants to send a message about the changing dynamics across the Taiwan Strait, not only to Taiwan, but to the international community, including the United States, at a time of increasing tensions with Washington. In an apparent attempt to de-escalate the situation, US President Joe Biden weighed in on the ongoing tensions. Biden seemed to confirm the United States' continued commitment to giving China diplomatic recognition in return for Beijing not threatening Taiwan militarily.
We agree, we'll abide by the Taiwan agreement. That's where we are. And we made it clear that I don't think he should be doing anything other than abiding by the agreement.
This latest spat comes at a significant moment for the two neighbours, with China having just marked the October 1st anniversary of its founding and Taiwan about to celebrate its National Day. And both with very differing ideas on what their future relationship should look like. Rob McBride, Al Jazeera, Hong Kong.
After days of heightened tensions, a stern warning.
Taiwan independent separatism is the greatest obstacle to national reunification and a serious hidden danger to national rejuvenation.
The Chinese president stressed he sought a peaceful reunification, but his speech in Beijing's Great Hall of the People came following a surge in military and diplomatic tensions over the island, described by Taiwan's defense minister as the worst in 40 years. Since early October, China has sent dozens upon dozens of military planes into Taiwanese airspace. Taipei responded by sending its own fighter jets to monitor while avoiding any confrontation. As Beijing continued to flex its military muscles, a new report emerged on Thursday that the United States had been secretly training Taiwanese forces for months. This adding fuel to the fire as recent visits to Taiwan by French senators and by Australia's former Prime Minister irked China.
Taiwan does not seek military confrontation, but Taiwan will also do whatever it takes to defend its freedom and democratic way of life.
China regards Taiwan as a rebel region that must be reunited with the mainland and has maintained a policy that any movement towards independence by the Taiwanese government will be met by the threat of invasion. Only 14 countries in the world, plus the Holy See, recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state. Others, including the United States, do not, but have, in an unofficial capacity, increasingly strengthened their ties with the democratic island.
Well, it's been 40. In the face of increasing pressure from China, including recent incursions by Chinese warplanes, this was Taiwan's response. A National Day celebration intended to show to its mighty neighbour and the world that it continues to be a vibrant democracy, determined to maintain its freedoms with sophisticated military hardware of its own, including new types of missiles being put on show for the first time. Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen was typically resistant to China's renewed pledge that reunification will happen.
The relationship between Taiwan and China will be achieved by negotiation. We will keep negotiating and will show the world that we are committed to self-defense. No one can force us to go to the pathway that is designed by China, because that road will not lead to solidarity and freedom for the people of Taiwan.
Tsai also said Hong Kong, where tough restrictions have been introduced to quell months of street protests and riots, should serve as a warning. Many people in Taiwan have looked on with alarm at the way Hong Kong's national security law has been implemented, quickly eroding many of the freedoms and rights the city had enjoyed, fearing their island would suffer a similar fate if it was reunited with China.
We are faced with a complex and severe challenge. Beijing authorities have shown what they have done to Hong Kong and suppressed Hong Kong.
China's President Xi Jinping has made reunification his mission to achieve what none of his predecessors have done. His latest call promises reunification can come peacefully, but threats in the past to use the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, to achieve it by force have rallied support for Tsai Ing-wen's defiance.
She's very successfully used the threat of mainland China, the threat of Xi Jinping and the PLA, to wake people in Taiwan up to the threat that they are facing and to mobilize the population around a Taiwan consensus that Taiwan's democracy is worth uniting for, it is worth struggling to protect.
It seems the more China pushes, the more pushback it gets from an island determined to follow its own path. Rob McBride, Al Jazeera, Hong Kong.
Healthcare workers were among the first to be offered vaccines in the United States, and many consider it a privilege as well as a responsibility.
I believe, the mandate is a good idea. I think people should get vaccinated.
But now it's no longer a choice. In New York, it is a state and soon to be federal requirement in the medical field.
Yeah, I think everybody should get mandated, I don't care. Forget them. If they want to get fired, let them get fired.
Here at Erie County Medical Center in Buffalo, New York, more than 95% of the staff are compliant, but the rest have been placed on unpaid leave, and the hospital has had to cut back on some procedures.
I mean, overall, it's going to affect the people that need the help. It's going to affect the patients and the people that are sick in nursing homes that are going to be understaffed. A lot of surgeries that are being canceled, so it's the patients that are being affected by it more than anybody else.
To ease staffing concerns, New York's governor has signed an executive order loosening restrictions on who can work in certain positions. But she's defending the mandate, which will also affect teachers.
Can't we just say that that is a basic right that everyone has to know that they'll be safe when they enter a healthcare facility, or you have your elderly parents or grandparents in a nursing home, that they will not get sick because of someone who's charged with their care?
Still, physician's assistant Deborah Conrad says she's been safely serving on the front lines of the pandemic without the vaccine and would rather lose the job she's held for nearly 2 decades than be forced to comply. She says she wants to see more long-term studies on vaccine side effects.
I have all my childhood vaccines, my updated vaccines, my children have their vaccines.
Just because I'm questioning this one, which is a new technology for a new virus, doesn't make me an anti-vaccine person. It just makes me somebody that wants informed consent.
The state of New York actually has one of the highest vaccination rates in the country. So if there are compliance and staffing issues here, the question is, what will that mean for the rest of the country, where there's more vaccine resistance and mandates from the federal government have yet to go into effect? Even before President Joe Biden mandated shots for businesses with more than 100 workers, however, dozens of high-profile companies, from United Airlines to Disney, had already begun insisting their workers get vaccinated. The federal mandates alone will cover as many as 100 million Americans, and if they achieve their goal, ensure there are enough healthy people available to fill any vacancies. KRISTEN, SALOOMEY, Al Jazeera, Buffalo, New York.
Rishi Sunak is the former investment bank analyst now running the UK's Treasury and widely regarded as a likely successor to the current Prime Minister Boris Johnson. When the UK went into COVID lockdown in 2020, Sunak's government-backed furlough scheme subsidised the salaries of more than 11 million workers at a cost of $95 billion. And now he says it's time to start balancing the books.
I have to be blunt with you. Our recovery comes with a cost. Our national debt is almost 100% of GDP, so we need to fix our public finances.
So this week, low-income families will stop receiving a temporary £20 or $27 a week uplift to a social benefit called universal credit. And taxes are going up too. It's going to be a very tough winter for some.
My great worry is that we're going to have lots more people pushed into the arms of loan sharks, forced to use food banks, and actually that's unnecessary. You know, the government could just continue with the £20 a week uplift into the winter, into the spring and summer next year, and that would just alleviate a huge amount of financial pressure on low-income families across the country, including here in Greater Manchester.
On Monday, the Army began helping to deliver fuel to petrol filling stations, a very visible sign of the UK's chronic shortage of truck drivers, and a situation which has caused petrol pumps to run dry and also seen empty shelves in supermarkets. Many economists are warning that the United Kingdom faces a cost of living crisis in the coming months as energy prices go up and the government claws back some of the benefits it paid out during the pandemic. What's not clear is whether the Chancellor's proposed ways of mitigating that damage are enough in deprived areas such as Salford. Proposals include a scheme called Kickstart to help young, low-income workers and incentives for companies to take on apprentices. In his Salford workshop, Mike Cleary says he's just about getting by.
We're ticking over, that's the main thing. We could do a lot better than what we are doing. But again, without proper training, without the money being pumped into apprenticeship schemes, then it's going to come to a standstill.
Next month, Rishi Sunak delivers a formal budget, which will detail the government's financial plans. But the indications are that for many in the UK, things are going to get worse before they might get better. Paul Brennan, Al Jazeera, Manchester.
The state electricity network has again collapsed. A lack of fuel forced Lebanon's largest power stations to shut down. It's the fourth time in the past months that shortages caused a countrywide blackout. A deep economic crisis means a cash-strapped state is struggling to import energy resources.
We used to have electricity for an hour daily. Now it is totally cut. We're spending our time outside our homes so our children can have fun.
The total power outage has practically been the case for months. State electricity in most places has been available for an hour or two a day. The company is now trying to use the Army's reserves to operate its power plants temporarily before the expected arrival of a fuel shipment. But the state-run plants have run poorly for decades.
There's been no electricity in Beirut since yesterday, and private generators are too expensive. How can we survive?
The energy sector has been a huge drain on the state's finances for decades. Its annual losses reach $1.5 billion. Successive governments have continued to sustain the system instead of fixing it. They've subsidized fuel and maintained a bloated workforce as part of the political parties' patronage networks. The international community has been demanding the restructuring of the sector before it approves financial assistance. There has been no political will. Instead, the authorities made a deal with Iraq to swap fuel for medical services, and the new government is negotiating supplies of electricity from Jordan and natural gas from Egypt via Syria. But those deals are likely to take months, and it may help ease the crisis, but it won't resolve it. Lebanese households have had to put up with daily power cuts since the end of the civil war in 1990. But now the local currency has lost 90% of its value. It means only a few are able to afford private generators, while hospitals, bakeries, and other essential services are in crisis mode. For many here, the electricity company has come to symbolize the corruption and mismanagement blamed for the economic collapse that has all but paralyzed the country. Zana Khuder, Al Jazeera, Beirut.
Eating every day has become a challenge for people like ERISTON, a former prisoner who lives on the streets of Rio de Janeiro. Surviving here the past year, he says, has been a challenge.
Since the beginning of the pandemic, the streets are very crowded and everything has become very difficult. Now no one stops here to help us. There are a lot of people dying because they couldn't get emergency aid.
The impact of COVID-19 has devastated Brazil. Almost 600,000 people have lost their lives, and millions have been forced into poverty amid rising food prices and unemployment. Researchers say at least 19 million Brazilians are struggling for food. And recent images of people scavenging animal carcasses for scraps of food have shocked the country, as the difficulties people are facing each day sink in.
I've taken meat from the truck many times. We take the meat and are happy. But now there's a lot of demand because everyone has caught on to it. They're either taking it from the truck or straight from the supermarket.
At the beginning of the pandemic, Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro campaigned against lockdowns, saying hunger was worse than COVID-19. That's why last year, the government distributed emergency cash handouts to help families and businesses. But this year, government aid has been dramatically scaled back.
Bolsonaro's problem is that, on the one hand, he has a very new liberal Minister of Economics that does not want to spend, does not want to provide direct help for the population. Bolsonaro always campaigned against the program. So he would say that Bolsa Familia was an immediate help, that Lula and the politicians from the Workers' Party, from PT, used to buy people's votes, to buy people's goodwill, right? So as an assistentialist program that would keep people from working. There's an ideological barrier there.
At this soup kitchen in Rio, hundreds of people are showing every day to receive a meal. They're in desperate need of help.
I was working, I had a job, I rented an apartment and I was able to pay the rent. I worked and earned a salary every month. Then the pandemic came, I lost my job, I couldn't pay my rent anymore.
Volunteers in this soup kitchen say most of those coming here face a similar situation. They have lost their jobs and cannot afford to pay a rent anymore. 20 years ago, Brazil became a success story when government programs pushed millions of people out of poverty. Now, it's an example of the government's inability to deal with the consequences of COVID-19. Teresa Bo, Al Jazeera.